learn about everything that we're up to is usually our website. So with that, I will introduce tonight's speaker. It is Dr. Phillip Papas. He has a PhD in history from the Graduate Center of the City University of New York, and he is currently a senior professor of history at the Union College of Union County, New Jersey. He is the author of That Ever Loyal Island, Staten Island and the American Revolution, Renegade Revolutionary, Life of General Charles Lee, and the co-author of Port Richmond. And his book, That Ever Loyal Island, inspired the documentary film Loyalty and Rebellion, in which he appears. So keep an eye out for that too. I know I'm gonna check that out later. So, Bill, I'm gonna pass it off to you now.
Thank you, Tom. I want to thank everybody for coming out tonight. I guess we got a feeling for what it was like to be in George Washington's army at Valley Forge or at Morristown in those really tough winters. I want to also thank the Middletown Township Historical Society and the Middletown Public Library for sponsoring this event this evening. Um, On November 30th, 1776, a private letter from General Charles Lee addressed to Colonel Joseph Reed, one of George Washington's aides, arrived at the Continental Army headquarters in New Brunswick. If you want to, Tom, if you want to get the slide, the next one. Yep. Thank you. Um, Lee took the opportunity in this letter to thank Reed for, quote, a most obliging, flattering letter dated November 21st, in which the young officer had admitted that the events of the recently completed New York campaign had shaken his confidence in Washington's abilities as commander. Quote, I do not mean to flatter nor praise you at the expense of any other, Reed told Lee, but I confess I do think that it is entirely owing to you that this army and the liberties of America, so far as they are depending on it, are not totally cut off. The officers and the soldiers generally have a confidence in you. The enemy constantly inquire where you are and seem to me to be less confident when you are present. In a November 21st letter, Reed had portrayed Washington as an indecisive leader. Quote, O General, an indecisive mind is one of the greatest misfortunes that can befall an army. How often have I lamented it with this campaign, he wrote. Lee responded to Reed that, quote, a fatal indecision of mind in war is a much greater disqualification than stupidity or even want of personal courage. Accident may put a decisive blunderer in the right, Lee wrote, but eternal defeat and miscarriage must attend the man of the best parts if cursed with indecision. Washington had accidentally opened the sealed envelope containing Lee's response and was stunned by its contents. Reed, one of his most trusted aides, and Lee, his second in command, wanted to see him replaced. It was a harsh reality check for Washington, but rather than make a public spectacle of the private exchange, he chose to let it pass in the interest of maintaining unity in the Army. In an act of great self restraint and character, Washington resealed the envelope and forwarded the letter to Reed with a note apologizing for mistakenly opening his private correspondence and never spoke of the incident again. Despite his disappointment, Washington understood that any confrontation between the Continental Army's two senior officers would be divisive at a time in the Revolutionary War when he was trying to hold the Army and the American cause together. Although Washington kept his thoughts private, Lee could not keep himself from publicly criticizing the commander in chief, especially for the disastrous New York campaign. In a letter to Dr. Benjamin Rush, a member of the Continental Congress, Lee condemned Washington's failure to override General Nathanael Greene's decision to reinforce Fort Washington on Manhattan. Quote, the affair at Fort Washington cannot surprise you in Philadelphia more than it amazed and stunned me, Lee wrote. I foresaw, I predicted all that has happened and urged the necessity of abandoning the garrison. For could we have kept it, it was of little or no use. End of quote. Lee alleged that he had explicitly warned Washington to draw off the garrison or they will all be lost. Lee was determined to prove that he was a better soldier and could be a better commander of the Continental Army than Washington. How would the American Revolutionary War have played out had the Patriots rejected Washington as the commander in chief in late 1776 and embraced Charles Lee for the post? This is an interesting question that will be explored in this talk tonight. Now, Charles Lee was a fascinating, complex character. He initially piqued my curiosity while I was writing my dissertation, which studied the loyalist sentiments of the residents of Staten Island, which became that ever loyal island. From February to March 1776, with limited manpower and resources. Tom, can you hit the next slide? Thanks. With limited manpower and resources, Lee put together the defensive plan for New York City against the potential British invasion. He constructed fortifications within the city and along its key water approaches on Brooklyn Heights in Long Island, Powlis Hook, now Jersey City in New Jersey, and in northeastern Manhattan near Hellgate. But Lee had left Staten Island, located at the entrance to New York Harbor, undefended in his plan. This did not mean, however, that Lee had not thought about the island and its residents strategically. He suggested that the Patriot authorities in New York and New Jersey coordinate efforts to remove livestock from the island. He also recommended that the Staten Islanders should be disarmed and their weapons given to a Continental regiment in need of them. Lee's suggestions seemed logical to me, but it was his recommendation to Congress's Board of War that the Patriots should secure the island's children as hostages for the good political behavior of their parents that made me think that he might make for an interesting subject of study one day, which led me to write Renegade Revolutionary. Lee has often been depicted as a debauched malcontent, a slovenly eccentric, an egomaniacal Continental officer who was followed around by a pack of mangy dogs who questioned General Washington's military judgment and his intellect, and was captured by the British in December 1776. Um, uh, a person who also faced a court-martial for his actions or his perceived inactions at the Battle of Monmouth in June of 1778, which eventually led to a court-martial and to the end of his military career. Hit the next slide, Tom. Thank you. Lee was an avid dog lover and always had a few by his side, especially his favorite black Pomeranian, Spado. You see here in the slide. Yes, Lee had an ego the size of Texas, but who else among the leading revolutionaries, including Washington, did not? And yes, he did question Washington's intelligence and challenged his military judgment. He was captured at the Widow White's Tavern in Basking Ridge in December of 76, faced a court-martial after the Battle of Monmouth in June of 1778, where Washington reprimanded him on the battlefield and supposedly swore so much that the leaves shook on all the nearby trees. Um, but this does not quite tell the whole story of Charles Lee, the intellectual who supported formal classical educations for women and who recognized America's potential as, quote, the last asylum of liberty for the world. It does not do justice to Charles Lee, the former British officer, who was an enthusiastic supporter of colonial resistance to British imperial policies, and who became one of the earliest, loudest, and most consistent voices for American independence. A professional soldier who admitted the fighting spirit of the colonial militiamen as citizens who admired the fighting spirit of the colonial militiamen as citizen soldiers and urged the revolutionaries to fight a war of petite guerre against the crown's forces. In many ways, Lee was Washington's alter ego. The aristocratic Washington was a colonial militia officer from Virginia with limited combat experience who longed to fight decisive conventional military engagements to cement his standing as an equal of regular army officers. Lee was a cosmopolitan British gentleman, career professional soldier, and an officer with extensive battlefield experience who extolled the virtues of the colonial fighting men and favored small, unconventional military engagements. Lee was born in Cheshire, England, the youngest of seven children. Lee and his sister Sydney, who remained his one constant confidant, were the only two of the seven siblings to survive childhood. In an age when one's background determined position in society, the Lees were middling gentry and locally influential. His father, John Lee, was a colonel in the British Army and commanded the 44th Regiment of Foot, while Lee's mother, Isabella Bunbury, boasted a more distinguished lineage. Her father, Sir Henry Bunbury, served as a member of Parliament and as High Sheriff for Cheshire, and an uncle, Sir Thomas Hamner, was Speaker of the House of Commons. Lee adored his father and inherited his father's intellectual curiosity. Colonel Lee encouraged Charles to read widely and to think critically. He instilled in his son a respect for natural rights and for human liberty. Quote, I was bred up from my infancy with the highest regard for the rights and liberties of mankind. My father possessed them to the highest degree, Lee once declared. Colonel Lee made sure that his son obtained a formal classical education, the kind of education that was expected of young British gentlemen. Colonel Lee also made sure that his daughter Sydney also gained a classical education. Um, Charles developed a passion for languages. He spoke seven languages fluently and was a voracious reader. He enjoyed military history, the works of Shakespeare, and the writings of the French philosophe Jean-Jacques Rousseau. But it was the great authors of antiquity that inspired in the young Lee romantic notions of democracy, republicanism, and citizenship, and introduced him to the ideals of heroism, honor, and courage as demonstrated in battle. Lee became a man of letters and of the Enlightenment, comfortable in the realm of ideas and intellectual debate. He was a soldier intellectual, who John Adams once said was perhaps the only revolutionary who knew more about military history and politics than he did, which is a lot coming from John Adams. Um, if Colonel Lee was Charles's best friend and mentor, perhaps his mother Isabella was his worst enemy. She was distant, maybe next to George Washington. She was distant and judgmental, insensitive, and unpredictable. Isabella largely ignored her son, and their relationship was tense. Yet Lee was very much like his mother. Isabella may have suffered from mental illness, which she passed along to him. From his mother, Lee inherited his temperamental nature, which was often revealed in dramatic mood swings that ranged from confident euphoria and a lack of impulse control to jealousy, delusions of power, moments of poor judgment, lethargy, anxiety, insecurity, slovenliness, and a violent temper. Lee's contemporaries often described him as eccentric, as mad, as rash, and Washington once stated that Lee was fickle. Mercy Otis Warren, the sister and wife of revolutionaries, described Lee as, quote, plain in his person even to ugliness, and careless in his manners to a degree of rudeness. His voice was rough, his garb was ordinary, and his deportment was morose. Colonel Lee's unexpected death in 1750 devastated Charles, who 2 years earlier had joined his father's regiment, the 44th, in active service as an ensign. Charles used some of his inheritance to eventually purchase a lieutenancy in the regiment. In October of 1754, the 44th Regiment was called into active duty in the French and Indian War. The 44th arrived in North America in March of 1755 as part of the British Expeditionary Force commanded by General Edward Braddock, and was involved in the ill-fated Battle of the Monongahela in July, when British units were ambushed and shot up badly by the French and their Native American allies near Fort Duquesne, present-day Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Next slide, Tom. Uh, Lee may have crossed paths with Washington during that campaign. Washington was a Virginia militia officer, and he was serving as an aide to General Braddock. After the debacle along the Monongahela, the 44th spent the winter of 1755 to 56 in Albany, New York, where Lee befriended the British Superintendent for Indian Affairs, Sir William Johnson. Next slide, Tom. Um, and Lee immersed himself in Native American culture. He learned to speak Iroquoian, met with Seneca and Mohawk tribal leaders, and took a daughter of the Seneca chief White Thunder as his mistress. The Native Americans gave Lee the tribal name Onewadarica, which loosely translates to boiling water or one whose spirit never sleeps. Lee took part in the aborted attempt to capture the French fortress at Louisbourg in 1757. He saw action at Fort Carillon, became Fort Ticonderoga in 1758, where he was seriously wounded when a musket ball shattered two of his ribs. At Fort Niagara, he was also involved in the campaign against Fort Niagara in 1759 and in General Jeffrey Amherst's successful expedition against Montreal in 1760. By 1760, Lee had attained the rank of captain and had demonstrated courage on the battlefield. But he had also gained a reputation for brusqueness and arrogance, often quarreling with commanding officers. Lee went home to Britain at the conclusion of his North American service. An astute student of military history and tactics, Lee's combat experiences in North America had taught him several lessons. He noticed that the Native Americans, and to an extent the colonial militia, were proficient at petite guerre. They were lightly armed, highly mobile guerrilla fighters who were efficient at small scale skirmishes where they attacked swiftly and with stealth, routinely used the ambush as a tactic, were experts at firing from natural cover, and effectively used psychological warfare against their enemies. In 1762, Lee was transferred to the 103rd Regiment of Foot, one of 5 units raised to assist Britain's ally Portugal against Spain during the Seven Years' War. He served under General John Burgoyne in Portugal, who commanded an Anglo-Portuguese expedition against Spain on the Iberian Peninsula. During the expedition, Lee commanded 250 British grenadiers and 50 cavalrymen from the 16th Light Dragoons in a successful nighttime raid against a key Spanish supply depot in the Portuguese town of Vila Velha, in which he applied the lessons of petite guerre that he had learned in North America, especially stealth and ambush, to the mission. Lee's capture of this very important supply depot stymied Spain's military plan against Portugal. In gratitude for his service, the Portuguese made Lee a colonel, but he did not obtain the two things he craved the most: public recognition for his actions from his British superiors. Burgoyne was credited with the success at Vila Velha, and a promotion to a senior officer's rank in the British Army. At the conclusion of the Seven Years' War, the British military scaled back, and Lee was forced into retirement as a major on half pay. He eventually found employment outside of the British Empire as a military aide to the Polish monarch, King Stanislaus Poniatowski. Tom, can you get the next slide? And this is King Stanislaus. Um, King Stanislaus became in King Stanislaus. Lee found his intellectual kindred spirit. Lee and King Stanislaus would sit down and talk for hours about Shakespeare, about philosophy, about ancient history. In 1768, Lee was commissioned a major general in the Polish army and was given one of the highest military honors in Eastern Europe, the Order of the Knights of St. Stanislaus. Lee served in the Polish army during a period of civil war and was later assigned as a military advisor to the Russian army of Catherine the Great in Poland during the Russo-Turkish War. Lee had experienced the brutality of war in North America and in Portugal, but nothing had prepared him for the slaughter that he witnessed in Eastern Europe, where unconventional tactics more than conventional strategies shaped warfare. Small bands of guerrilla fighters, usually affiliated with local warlords or with one of the major belligerents, impeded or disrupted regular military forces and left a disturbing trail of death and destruction among soldiers and civilians. Lee commented that guerrilla fighters often hanged, quote, all the Russians generally from by the feet who fall into their clutches, and the Russians put the guerrilla fighters to the sword, guerrilla fighters who they've captured to the sword. Meanwhile, bands of independent irregulars roamed the countryside where they would, quote, rob, strip, and murder anybody of every religion, color, and complexion who falls into their hands, Lee wrote. The brutality of war that Lee had experienced in North America, Portugal, and in Eastern Europe had psychologically affected him, and he began to demonstrate a lack of empathy for the suffering of others. Perhaps the wartime brutalization that Lee had suffered was reflected in the cold nature of his suggestion in March of 1776 to separate the children of Staten Island from their parents, or the ruthlessness of his order a month later to raise the Loyalist stronghold of Portsmouth, Virginia, as a message to anyone aiding the British in the Chesapeake region, or in the callousness of his decision in the fall of 1776 to allow his troops to plunder the homes of Loyalists in northern New Jersey without repercussions. Lee's experiences also left him with little patience for conventional tactics. In America, he developed an affinity for the frontier style warfare practiced by the Native Americans and the colonial militia. But in Eastern Europe, Lee became firmly convinced that small bands of well trained guerrilla fighters could defeat conventional armies. He had become transformed into a British regular inclined to unconventional methods of warfare, taking an opposite trajectory than George Washington. Lee returned to Britain from Eastern Europe in 1771 and immediately threw himself into politics. Lee supported the Whigs and the Whig position in England. He voiced his support of the Americans, urging them to take the strongest possible measures against the British government and George III, who he denounced as a tyrant who was moving Britain closer to absolutism. You can hit the next slide, Tom. Angry that George III had not helped to advance his military career, Lee also published a series of biting critiques and political satire of the British monarch. Lee no longer had a future in Britain. His career and time there were essentially over. In 1773, he resigned his military commission and migrated to America, purchasing 3,000 acres and a modest homestead in Berkeley County in Western Virginia, which is now part of West Virginia, at the suggestion of an old Army buddy, Horatio Gates. In November 1774, Lee produced a pamphlet titled Strictures upon a Pamphlet entitled A Friendly Address to the Reasonable People of America, which had been written by Dr. Miles Cooper, the president of King's College, which is today Columbia University. Um, in this pamphlet, Lee praised the colonial fighting spirit of the militiamen of the various colonial militias. Uh, this pamphlet instilled confidence in the Patriots by arguing that should the current political crisis turn into a war, American militiamen fighting for their liberties could defeat British regulars, which brings us to the Revolutionary War. When war between the British government and its American colonists began in April 1775, Lee offered his services to the Continental Congress. Washington requested his appointment, and Congress duly granted his request. Lee was appointed the second most major general behind Washington and General Artemus Ward of Massachusetts, who was at the time commanding troops during the siege of Boston. Washington described Lee as, quote, the first officer in military knowledge and experience, end of quote, in the entire Continental Army. And John Adams wrote to his wife Abigail that although Lee was, quote, a queer creature, he was willing to forgive 1,000 whims for the sake of the soldier and the scholar. Lee traveled with Washington from Philadelphia to Boston, arriving in early July, and took command of the Northern Continental Division, or the left wing of the Army, which was in Charlestown during the siege of Boston. Next slide, Tom. Thank you. Rhode Islander Nathaniel Greene was one of Lee's brigadiers. Eventually, Artemus Ward resigned due to poor health, leaving Lee as a subordinate only to Washington. So now Lee's moved up to Washington's second in command. From the summer of 1775 into the summer of 76, Lee worked effectively with Washington around Boston, and when ordered to do so, did his best to design defenses for Newport, Rhode Island, and New York City. He was eventually given command of the Continental Army's Southern Department and gained acclaim for strengthening the defenses of Virginia, and in June 1776 for helping to frustrate a major British assault against Charleston, South Carolina. Congress was eager to utilize Lee's military skills wherever and whenever possible. John Adams wrote to him effusively, "We want you at New York. We want you at Cambridge. We want you in Virginia. In light of the high estimation the members of Congress have of you, of your worth and abilities, everyone wants you where he most has where he had most at stake." End of quote. By contrast, Washington's reputation faltered as the summer of 76 wore on, and the Continental Army was forced off of Long Island in late August and lost New York City in mid September. In October, Congress urgently summoned Lee from the South to join Washington's army, which had retreated and encamped on Harlem Heights in northern Manhattan. Lee suggested that Washington abandon the post and move his troops into Westchester County. Washington eventually ordered a retreat to White Plains, but at the insistence of General Nathaniel Greene, Lee's former brigadier, he decided to maintain a garrison of more than 2,000 men at Fort Washington, which was eventually captured by the British on November 16th, greatly frustrating Lee. The very existence of the Continental Army now seemed in question. After the Battle of White Plains on October 28, 1776, Washington left Lee in command of 7,500 troops in Westchester to protect New England, while he led an army with roughly 2,000 men into New Jersey, pursued by British forces commanded by General Charles Lord Cornwallis. As Washington's army retreated across New Jersey towards the Delaware River, he repeatedly asked Lee to reinforce him, but the latter chose to keep his division in Westchester despite the commander-in-chief's pleas. By December 2nd, many of Washington's troops began to cross the Delaware into Pennsylvania. Even after he moved his forces across the ice-strewn Hudson River at Kings Ferry, New York on December 5th, Lee delayed joining the fragments of Washington's army that remained in New Jersey. He then moved an army that was poorly equipped, malnutritioned, that was facing many desertions. Lee moved that army through north central New Jersey, but very slowly, basically at a snail's pace. Um, and so Washington is pleading with Lee to join up with him, and Lee is moving through north central New Jersey slowly. Washington made his share of tactical mistakes during the New York campaign of 1776, and it was at this point that Lee began to align himself with the commander-in-chief's critics, voicing his displeasure at Washington's leadership of the army and criticizing his military acumen, a pattern not unlike the one that Lee had set against his British commanding officers during the French and Indian War. Lee was convinced that he and not Washington knew how best to defeat the British. For Lee, Washington had demonstrated that he was not a worthy commander in chief who deserved unquestioned obedience. Instead, Lee believed it was best for him to try to maintain an independent command, and if Cornwallis was to crush Washington's army, which seemed to him possible, Lee could take the military reins and fight the kind of war against the British that he had envisioned based on a frontier style, based on a frontier style and unconventional tactics. By the fall of 1776, it had become obvious that both men had different views of the rank and file American soldier and how to pursue the war. The aristocratic Washington often disparaged the troops under his command as an unprofessional and undisciplined rabble, while the career soldier Lee extolled the virtues of the colonial fighting men. Whereas Washington wanted to create a professional European style army of well disciplined troops with long term enlistments, Lee envisioned a strategy where militiamen uh, uh, prosecuted a guerrilla war. On December 8th, Lee explained to the Continental Congress that the reason for his delay in joining Washington, Lee was convinced that the British would not move on Philadelphia, as Washington had feared. Instead, Lee said they would stop for the winter in New Jersey, where Lee hoped to, quote, annoy, distract, and consequently weaken the enemy in a desultory war, meaning a guerrilla war. While marching through north central New Jersey, one of Lee's men remarked that the area was, quote, full of them cursed creatures, the Tories. In retaliation for the loyalist sympathies of some residents, Lee announced that he would, quote, clothe my people at the expense of the Tories, which has a double good effect. It puts them in spirits and comfort, and it is a correction of the iniquity of the foes of liberty. He then gave his troops carte blanche to plunder the homes of loyalists or suspected loyalists of clothes, shoes, arms, ammunition, horses, wood, and other items. Lee was now planning to divide his Continental troops into smaller units, disperse them among the civilian population, and coordinate guerrilla operations with New Jersey Patriot militia and roving bands of partisans to harass the British Army's flanks and rear guard, attack outposts, supply depots, and foraging and scouting parties, cut off the British lines of communication, which stretched into New York, to intimidate and neutralize local loyalists and eventually wear down the British troops. Lee believed that the rugged terrain of north central New Jersey was conducive to this kind of irregular warfare, and that such a strategy would build confidence in the Continental Army and the Revolution. By contrast, Washington was consistent in his belief that irregular forces and an army of short term enlistments were incapable of delivering a major strike against the British. Washington did not want to depend on short term recruits and on undisciplined and unreliable militia against the enemy. Washington's commitment to military professionalism involved adopting European tactics of linear formations, maneuver, and concentrated fire on a conventional battlefield. And these tactics would eventually be introduced into the Continental Army by the Baron von Steuben during the Valley Forge encampment of 1777 into 1778. If you want to hit the next slide, Tom, there's the Baron von Steuben. Um, but Lee deemed free Americans unsuited to such regimented methods, which he viewed as more suited to the armies of despots. Lee also doubted that the Americans could raise an army of regulars capable of confronting the British in a conventional war. Instead, he urged Washington and other revolutionary leaders to adopt petite guerre against the British. Lee argued that instead of amassing troops for large conventional battles, the Americans should undertake relentless hit and run attacks, ambushes, and small skirmishes against the enemy. Lee favored forming the army along the lines of a national militia, dividing it into smaller detachments of soldiers drafted from the state militias who were proficient in irregular tactics, a practice that he believed was consistent with the colonial military tradition. The officers of these detachments could coordinate their operations with the activities of local militia and roving bands of partisans. He explained that smaller detachments had the ability to move swiftly and did not need as many supplies since they could easily forage off the land. Moreover, these smaller, more mobile units could effectively carry out movements and maneuvers aimed at ambushing British patrols, capturing supply depots, and harassing the enemy's lines of communications. While local partisans could be used to administer and to enforce loyalty oaths, intimidate and retaliate against loyalists, and draw neutrals into the revolutionary cause. Lee believed that if adopted, this strategy would sow chaos and confusion among the British troops and their German allies, causing them to abandon their preferred methodical linear movements, what he called the European plan of warfare, in favor of improvised and reactive tactics, which they were wholly unprepared to implement. The goal of this strategy was to perpetuate a war of attrition, to keep the British and their allies off balance, to inflict as many casualties as possible, and to leave the military and the British people demoralized. Thus, the bones of Lee's strategy were clear. He rejected linear movements and open field engagements, which played on the strengths of European armies. Americans should refuse to fight the Redcoats' fight. Lee demanded instead that the Patriots exploit their advantage of terrain and geographic position. They needed to adopt a strategy that kept with the history of North American frontier warfare and their tradition of liberty. Even as a group of colonies hemmed in along the Atlantic coast, the nation United States enjoyed vast geographic depth relative to the numbers of British troops available to pacify it. The size of colonial society in America diluted British combat strength, like how the broad Atlantic Ocean made it difficult for the British government to deploy reinforcements and supplies to prosecute the war. You can hit the next slide, Tom. This made for opportune ground to apply a strategy that would see the Patriots waging a guerrilla-style war in the hinterland, drawing British forces into protracted, frontless, frustrating warfare they stood little chance of winning. If necessary, Lee advised that Patriot forces should pull back behind the Susquehanna River. But on December 12, 1776, Lee was captured by a British patrol, ironically from the 16th Light Dragoons, the same unit that he had commanded during the raid on Vila Velha in Portugal, at the Widow White's Tavern in Basking Ridge, which was 3 miles away from his troops who were encamped west of Morristown. You can hit the next slide, Tom. So this is Lee captured. Just minutes before his capture, Lee had finished a letter to Horatio Gates, who was now a general in the Continental Army. This letter was criticizing Washington. Lee wrote, entre nous, a certain great man is most damnably deficient. And we all know who Lee was talking about there. Lee's capture and his time in British custody, which was roughly 16 months, forestalled his efforts to sway the revolutionaries to adopt his unconventional military strategy. Lee was eventually exchanged in the spring of 78 for British General Richard Prescott. He rejoined the war effort during the Valley Forge encampment. His confidence in guerrilla warfare and desire to promote a reorganization of the Continental Army along the lines of a national militia remained unshaken. But during his time in British custody, much had changed in the Continental Army, in Washington's headquarters, and in the war itself. The French had entered the conflict, which altered the dynamics of military planning among Washington and his officers. There were also members of the Continental Officer Corps who had risen to prominence within Washington's inner circle while Lee was away. Alexander Hamilton, the Marquis de Lafayette, John Lawrence, Nathaniel Greene, the Pennsylvanian Anthony Wayne, just to name a few. The European-style training program that was introduced by the Prussian officer Baron von Steuben at Valley Forge gave Washington confidence in his troops' ability to perform the linear tactics necessary for a conventional battlefield encounter against the British, something he had been waiting patiently to be able to do. That opportunity eventually came on a sweltering Sunday in June 1778 at Monmouth Courthouse, where Washington's Continentals had caught up to the slowly moving British Army retreating across New Jersey from Philadelphia to New York. Washington gave Lee command of the Continental Army's vanguard. I mean, once Lee returned back to the officer corps, he assumed his position as second in command. So Washington gives Lee command of the Continental Army's vanguard and orders Lee to pursue an attack against the rear of the British column. Lee intended to attack, but was forced to retreat to more defensible ground when, without orders and without informing him, his subordinates pulled their troops back. Lee had also noticed that British Commander General Henry Clinton had reversed his order of march, putting his best troops on the rear guard. Faced with the prospect of the remainder of his men being pinned down against the ravine and possibly annihilated, Lee called for a general retreat to the Perrine Ridge, the same high ground on which Washington would make his defensive stand later that day. Lee also organized an effective delaying action that helped to stall the British advance, something that he has been rarely credited with doing. You can hit the next slide. Um, Nevertheless, irate to find the Continental troops in a general retreat, Washington confronted Lee on the battlefield and reprimanded him. This is the very famous painting by Emanuel Lutz of Washington's reprimand of Lee on the battlefield at Monmouth. After the battle, Lee was charged in a court martial with insubordination, failing to attack the enemy, and making an unnecessary and shameful retreat, and disrespecting the commander in chief. After 5 weeks in which Lee performed admirably in his own defense, he was found guilty and suspended from the Continental Service for 1 year, a suspension that was ultimately upheld by Congress. But instead of accepting the suspension, Lee made matters worse by turning the situation into a political contest between him and Washington, criticizing Congress and becoming embroiled in several affairs of honor. This misguided choice cost Lee any lingering support he may have had in Congress, which voted to permanently suspend him from the Continental Army, effectively ending his military career. Lee died on October 3rd, 1782, in a room on the second floor of the Conestoga Inn on Market Street in Philadelphia. He died from complications due to consumption. You can hit the next slide. Um, and this is Lee's place of burial at Christ Church and Churchyard in Philadelphia. Um, Lee's death was barely noticed or even mentioned amid the expectations of America's ultimate victory over Britain. Um, Lee was buried in Christ Churchyard in Philadelphia. Lee's opponents in the military and outside of it, including Washington, argued that his advocacy of petite guerre had the potential to undermine national unity, since it more than likely would have exacerbated the localism and provincialism that were significant characteristics of American society before the war. Many leading revolutionaries feared that if adopted, Lee's strategy would turn the conflict into a localized war and unleash a torrent of popular violence, devolving into a struggle of reprisals and counter reprisals, which was precisely what happened in Eastern Europe during Lee's time there, and eventually in the southern backcountry in the Revolutionary War. It was the contention of Washington and others that reliance on a strategy that emphasized small detachments of Continental troops coordinating operations with local militias and roving bands of partisans would lead to the political fragmentation of the Revolution and of American society, and to a full-scale civil war directed by local warlords and juntas. For Lee, however, the choice was clear. Either the Americans could try to preserve society by fighting conventional battles against the British at the risk of losing the war, or they could risk that society by fighting a guerrilla-style insurgency that would prolong the war but give them their best chance to defeat Britain and win their independence. Many American leaders, including Washington, were not prepared to tear their society apart to fight a large scale guerrilla war. Lee seems to have been the only revolutionary who was willing to consciously risk societal upheaval by waging a full scale guerrilla war for independence. The realization of Lee's strategy, one that blurred the lines between soldier and civilian, meant fighting a wholly different war than the one envisioned by Washington and other American officers who were continental in their thoughts. For Washington, the key to winning independence was national political unity. And the key to national political unity was, was forging the Continental Army into a strong national army with long term enlistments under a central command structure subordinate to the civil authority of Congress and that could carry out conventional operations, if only on a small scale. Washington and other revolutionaries sought to preserve their society, a society that had achieved one of the highest standards of living in the world, not to destroy it. They hoped to win their independence without risking the social and institutional fabric of American society. Many of them, including Washington, believed that this goal could only be accomplished by turning the Continental Army into a disciplined, centralized professional army under the control of the Continental Congress. Washington viewed the Continental Army as the key to the Revolution's survival and did his best to keep it together by never risking all of it without having an avenue of retreat. For the revolution to succeed, Washington truly believed the Continental Army had to remain intact. In Washington's strategy, militia and irregular troops were used to screen the Continental Army from the enemy or as reinforcements and to undertake local defense, gather intelligence, and conduct operations to harass and to help impede British movements. These forces played a supporting role to the Continental Army. They did not become a substitute for it. Lee's strategy of fighting a guerrilla war of attrition had some merit. His appraisal of colonial territory and resources revealed considerable advantages even while the Patriots remained the weaker antagonist. Stretching out the war in a bid to outlast the British government and population, whose resolve and patience were far from infinite, was a viable strategic concept. But think about the potential negative consequences of such a strategy. Had Lee prevailed, the United States would have been a vastly different place than the free republic that emerged from the cauldron of the American Revolutionary War. Lee was not one to shrink from using armed force to compel recalcitrant citizens to comply with or to join the patriot cause, nor was he always amenable to following the dictates of civilian authorities. The American Revolution was on some levels a civil war, that pitted neighbor against neighbor, but Lee's strategy and his methods would have amplified that civil strife. Washington's critique of Lee's strategy focused on its potential to tear the fabric of American life, dividing America into zones of resistance that would undermine the political process and throw power to local juntas, eventually creating a thoroughly balkanized society. In the end, the Patriots rebuffed Lee's political and military radicalism. Washington's idea for the Army and for the conduct of the war proved correct. But that does not mean Charles Lee's support of the American revolutionaries, his contributions to the movement for independence, and his alternative vision of combat against Britain should be ignored. After all, his methods found their way into his one time Brigadier Nathaniel Greene's conduct of operations in the South, which ultimately helped to defeat Britain and to win America's independence. I want to thank everybody for coming out tonight, and I want to thank Tom again for manning the slideshow. And I'll take questions if you have any questions. Once again, thank you, everybody. Thank you to the Middletown Township Historical Society, to the library, and to the audience.
Thanks, Phil. Yeah, if anybody has questions, put it into the chat. And Phil, we have a couple. I can read them to you and you can respond. This question is about Washington. Was he a better leader than he was as a general?
Washington was an amazing leader. I mean, he had a craft for leadership. You know, he was very savvy. He knew when to he knew how to sort of mobilize his forces. As a tactician, you could see he was definitely outgeneraled in New York. But as a leader, as a commander, you know, Washington was bar none fantastic. Um, he knew how to get the most out of his men, and he knew how to push his men forward, how to sort of put his foot on the gas pedal, so to speak, and knew when to put the pressure off. I mean, as a commander, he understood the relationship with the Continental Congress. Even though it frustrated him a lot, he understood this idea of uh, civilian authority over the military, something that Lee totally disregarded. Lee was like, generals should make the decisions for the military, not politicians. And so I would say Washington better leader than tactician.
Mhm. There's another question. I think you might have already answered this, but it's a what if question. If Lee had become commander in chief and implemented his philosophy, do you think he would have won the war?
I think the war would have been a much longer war. It would have been prolonged. I think, as I mentioned in the talk, I think what would have happened was American society would have been ripped apart. I mean, what you would have emerging is sort of like local commanders, guys who were respected on a local level, taking sort of political control and military control of different areas. It would have been as I mentioned, a highly, thoroughly balkanized society. I mean, you might have had certain areas that became independent, certain areas that were still under British control. I mean, you would not have had a unified American republic.
Mhm.
It
Another
definitely would have
question
strung the war out longer.
was the type of warfare advocated by Lee exemplified by the militia during the British withdrawal from Lexington and Concord?
So that's what he was advocating, like firing from natural cover, hit and run raids, small scale operations, ambushes, using psychological warfare on local populations. That's the kind of warfare he was advocating. He believed that he believed that if this is truly a revolution for democracy and liberty and freedom, then that type of strategy promotes the most democracy, the most liberty. That the colonial tradition, fighting tradition, was about freedom and liberty, and that if that you know org army around a sort of centralized national professional army structure, military structure, was the army of despots. That's what you found in Europe. And it's the kind of army structure that those who crave power love, because it becomes, the arm of their power. And they could use that army to, suppress freedom, suppress liberty. If and this was a lot of his criticism of Washington, that Washington was power hungry, that Washington wanted this kind of army because Washington was really moving towards becoming sort of like a dictator. He warned that a lot of Americans and a lot of Continental officers were starting to view Washington as almost godlike, and that's dangerous. Um, and so um, I think definitely Lee. That's the kind of warfare that Lee was supporting. You know, Sort of pulling back, trying to lure the British into the hinterland. The Americans are very familiar with their terrain. This is where they live. This is where they grew up, right? They hunted in these areas. So the British troops are unfamiliar. British officers are unfamiliar. They can have, many maps about these areas, but they're not familiar with the terrain. They don't know how to use the terrain. And so, so Lee was advocating that kind of a war, stretching out their supply lines and communications lines, then cutting them off using small scale, operations, a very mobile type of, again, he was looking at a national militia, not a national army.
Hmm. Okay. Well, time for a couple more questions. Do you think that egos alone prevented Washington and Lee from having a better, more professional relationship?
I mean, I think that was part of it, but I mean, Lee was important to Washington in the beginning of the war. Washington did not have that much combat experience. I mean, he did see some combat in the French and Indian War. He was on the staff of General Edward Braddock, but Lee saw extensive combat action. Lee planned out missions like the one at Villa Vela. Um, Washington understood his limitations when it came to tactics, and he understood he needed guys like Lee around him. Lee also knew the British Army. He knew it very well. He knew a lot of the commanders of the British Army. So Washington can also rely on Lee for some inside information on some of these guys. But Lee was also very proficient at sort of setting up defensive works. And that's why Washington sent him to Newport, Rhode Island, to set up the defenses of that town. He sent him to New York City to figure out the defenses of New York, in which Lee said, "Yeah, we're never gonna be able to hold this city because there's too many islands and waterways here. But we could create a defensive scheme for New York that's going to make the British um, lose a considerable amount of men. They'll still capture the city, but maybe we can make them pay for it somewhat." Washington understood that Lee had that experience that he lacked. And so Lee was very valuable. I mean, the Continental Congress also knew it. I mean, I think I quoted from the letter, "We want you in Virginia. We want you in New York. We want you everywhere where we need you." They understood Lee's value, his military expertise, his military experience. But what happens, Washington becomes more settled as a commander. And what hurts Lee a lot too is when he's taken out of the picture when he's captured by the British, the whole war changes. The French enter the war. Washington's headquarters changes. Newer guys rise up in the ranks. They get within Washington's inner circle. These are guys who think like Washington. They think continentally. They think nationally. They think about a centralized command structure of an army, a national army. And you know, Lee's, Lee's views are seen as, out there, right? And as risky and as too radical um, for, as too radical to adopt. And so, I mean, did Lee have an ego? Oh, certainly. Did Washington have an ego? Certainly. Um, and and Lee also had a penchant um, for criticizing his superior officers, which hurt him in the British Army. It's one of the reasons why he wasn't getting promoted. I mean, every time he would just come out and criticize his commanding officers. I mean, at one point he called General Abercrombie of the British Army the blunderer chief and the commanding booby in chief. I mean, and that kind of attitude he brings to the Continental Army. Um, I always say I would love to be a fly on the wall of Washington's war cabinets, his war councils when Lee was there, and would love to love to hear the reactions to some of Lee's ideas. And Lee was a contrarian. But he was also a gadfly. He would also throw questions out there and and make people think about alternative strategies, alternative methods. So, I mean, I think yes, part of it was ego. Um, I also think the war had passed Lee by 1778. Um, and so, it, it- and Lee was starting to grate on people's nerves. And so, in a way, it was time for him to go.
All right, one final important question for you. How can somebody purchase your books?
Okay. You could purchase them through the NYU Press website. They were both published by NYU Press. So you can find them on NYU Press. You can find them on Amazon, barnesandnoble.com. You can order them through Barnes and Noble if you go to one of their stores. Um, so
All right, great. All right, well, thank you, Phil, for doing this. This was great, and thank you everybody for attending. Want more info on us? MiddletownNJHistory.org. Hope to see you next month. Thanks,
thank you,
everybody.
everybody. Thanks for coming out, everyone. Thank you. Be safe in this weather.
You too.